We would like to send out a special thanks to Faraday for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Faraday is a family-run brand making high-quality, timeless clothing with modern design and functionality. Get 20% off your first purchase by going to faradaybrand.com/cold with promo code COLD at checkout. Thank you and enjoy the show. December 5th, 1998. Klamath County, Oregon. 8-year-old Derrick Engebretson travels to Winema National Forest with his father and grandfather in order to get a Christmas tree, but winds up becoming separated from them. An extensive search effort fails to find Derrick, though an eyewitness reports having seen a boy matching Derrick's description struggling with an unidentified man near the road. Years later, a convicted child predator named Frank Milligan confesses to Derrick's murder, but fails to lead the authorities to his body and recants his confession, so Derrick continues to remain a missing person. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering a pair of cold cases involving young boys who went missing in the wilderness. The 1998 disappearance of 8-year-old Derrick Engebretson, and the 1975 disappearance of 4-year-old Kurt Newton. Since we've entered the month of December, our podcast is now going to be counting down to Christmas by covering cases which have some sort of connection to the holidays. Derrick Engebretson went missing in the woods while on an outing with his family to get a Christmas tree, and since the area would be hit with a snowstorm shortly thereafter, the most likely explanation is that he simply died of exposure and the search efforts failed to find his remains. However, there is some evidence to suggest that Derrick was the victim of an abduction, as a convicted child predator named Frank Milligan would eventually confess to his murder, and while Milligan recanted his confession, the possibility of him being responsible cannot be ruled out. I also decided to cover the disappearance of Kurt Newton, since it was originally suggested to me earlier this year by Scott from the Amazing Maine podcast, and this will mark the first time I've actually covered an unsolved case from the state of Maine. Kurt was a 4-year-old boy who became separated from his family on a camping trip, but no evidence could be found to indicate what happened to him, and it was almost like he literally vanished into thin air. I'll start off this episode by describing the events of Derrick's disappearance before I move on to Kurt's case, and then I'll provide my theories and analysis of both these stories. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let's now start off by exploring the disappearance of Derrick Engebretson. Our first story begins in Oregon in 1998. Our central figure is 8-year-old Derrick Engebretson, who lives with his family just outside Bonanza, a small farming town with a population of around 400 people located in Klamath County near the California state line. Derrick's parents are Robert and Lori Engebretson, and he has 2 older siblings, 18-year-old Amy and 15-year-old Kenny. On December the 5th, Derrick, Robert, and Derrick's 64-year-old paternal grandfather, Bob Engebretson, all decided to leave on a trip to get a Christmas tree. Even though it was annual tradition for the family to go on an excursion into the wilderness to get a tree, Lori had convinced her husband to put up an artificial tree in their home this year. However, the Engebretsons had a disabled neighbor who was unable to obtain his own Christmas tree, so Robert offered to go get one for him and took Derrick along. They would travel over 60 miles northwest to the steep, rugged, and densely wooded terrain of a dormant shield volcano known as Pelican Butte, located in Winema National Forest on the northern end of Upper Klamath Lake, near the unincorporated community of Rocky Point. Even though he was only 8 years old, Derrick loved the outdoors and was accustomed to walking long distances through mountain terrain. In fact, his parents' nickname for him was Bear Boy, as his mother had put him in a pack and taken him on a bear hunt when he was only 1 week old. After driving to Pelican Butte and parking their pickup truck at a turnout on West Side Road at around 2 p.m., Derrick, Robert, and Bob started hiking up an embankment into a pine forest, but Robert soon got far ahead of the group and went up a snowy hill. Even though Robert had told Derrick to stay with his grandfather, Derrick wanted to catch up to his father and help cut down a Christmas tree, so Bob gave him a hatchet and told Derrick to go on ahead and follow Robert's footprints up the hill. Derrick went off in that direction until he was out of Bob's sight, but at around 3 o'clock, Bob and Robert finally met up again. They were each under the mistaken impression that Derrick was with the other, so they attempted to search for him without success. By 4 o'clock, Derrick had still not been found, and it was starting to get dark, so Robert went to the road and flagged down a passing motorist and asked him to call for help. The motorist drove to nearby Rocky Point Resort and called 911, and later that night, the Klamath County Sheriff's Office and the Klamath County Search and Rescue Team would launch an extensive air and ground search of Winema National Forest, which involved tracking dogs, snowmobiles, a Civil Air Patrol plane, and an Air Force Reserve helicopter equipped with an infrared scanner. Derrick's maternal grandfather, Ben Davis, eventually became involved in the search, and since he was known for being an excellent tracker, he was able to come across some small, child-sized footprints in the snow which appeared to belong to Derrick. These footprints made a loop from the location where Derrick's family had last seen him and wound up at a clearing, where a small snow angel which Derrick likely made was discovered on the ground. While there were more footprints leading away from the spot, they had inadvertently been obliterated by a snowplow which had passed through the area, so it was impossible to determine which direction Derrick had been heading. However, since the clearing was in fairly close proximity to the locations where the Engebretsons had parked their pickup truck, it was possible that Derrick had made it to the road. Unfortunately, the search effort was seriously hampered when a blizzard hit the area, and since temperatures dipped below zero, it was feared that Derrick might have frozen to death or succumbed to the elements. Searchers did come across some items in the woods which may have been connected to Derrick, including a candy wrapper and a bookmark from Bonanza Elementary School, which had the logo for the Goosebumps book series on it. Derrick attended this school as a third grader and was a huge Goosebumps fan, as he even had the Goosebumps logo on the gloves he was wearing at the time, but it could not be determined if the bookmark belonged to him. The searchers also came across a crude, makeshift lean-to shelter made of fir boughs, which was located beneath several fallen logs. Since Derrick had been carrying a hatchet, there was hope that he might have built the shelter himself, but tracker dogs did not seem to detect Derrick's scent at the location. Searchers also attempted to find the hatchet that Derrick was carrying at the time he vanished, but it failed to turn up. At one point, a child's footprint and a hole in the ice were found on the bank of a shallow inlet, but even though searches were performed of the water with divers and a metal detector, they turned up no trace of Derrick or the hatchet. The entire search effort was finally suspended after 8 days, and by this point, Robert Engebretson had spent so much time looking for his son in the freezing weather that he became ill and developed pneumonia. But even after the official search from law enforcement came to an end, the Engebretsons would continue to perform their own independent search with numerous volunteers. They spent the next 2 weeks at the site in a donated camper van and kept a large bonfire burning in the hopes that Derrick would see it. However, by December the 18th, the sub-zero temperatures made it unsafe for anyone to travel through the forest, so all search efforts were suspended. In spite of this, the Engebretsons would keep returning to the area virtually every weekend over the next year to keep looking for Derrick. Robert and Bob Engebretson were both extensively questioned about Derrick's disappearance and passed polygraph tests, so they were not considered to be suspects. Unfortunately, the whole situation would cause Robert to develop a lot of resentment against his father, as he blamed Bob for losing Derrick, though he also blamed himself for failing to find him. Lori Engebretson had bought Derrick a remote-controlled Bigfoot truck and a laser-sighted BB gun for Christmas, and she would keep the wrapped gifts underneath their tree for an entire year in case Derrick ever returned. The Engebretsons would also memorialize Derrick every year by placing a Christmas tree decorated with teddy bears and ornaments near the spot where the family's pickup truck had been parked when he went missing. Since Derrick's disappearance forced Robert to take a lot of time off work from his job at a mill, and the Engebretsons spent thousands of dollars of their own money searching for Derrick, the family eventually went bankrupt and were forced to sell their home. While the authorities were inclined to believe that Derrick died of exposure and animals scattered his remains, there was evidence to suggest that he might have been abducted. An eyewitness claimed he was driving through the area on the same day Derrick vanished and passed by a young boy matching Derrick's description struggling with an unidentified man next to the side of the road. At the time, the witness assumed that this was nothing more than a boy having a fight with his father and elected not to stop, but he came forward after hearing about Derrick's disappearance. There were also numerous eyewitness reports of a man driving a black, two-door Honda sedan through the area that day, and he reportedly stopped and asked people for directions near Rocky Point. In September of 1999, investigators were informed that graffiti had been found scrawled on the wall of a restroom at the Sage Hen Rest area just outside the town of Hines, over 200 miles northwest of the area where Derrick went missing. While the authorities have never publicly revealed the exact contents of the graffiti, it reportedly made reference to Derrick being abducted, killed, and buried, so this portion of the restroom wall was removed and sent to a state laboratory for analysis. Derrick's parents actually traveled to the rest area themselves to view the graffiti, and Lori openly expressed her opinion that it was likely nothing more than a sick joke. She stated, quote, "All I can say is I hope if Derrick did die, I hope he died on that mountain and not at the hands of some sick person. If he died on the mountain, he just closed his eyes and went to sleep. There would have been no pain or anything." End quote. However, in 2001, the Engebretsons were surprised to find a handwritten letter in their mailbox containing the words, quote, "I know who took your son." It would turn out that the letter had been written by an inmate who had served time at the Marion County Jail in Salem and claimed he heard a 31-year-old child predator named Frank James Milligan brag about Derrick's murder. On July the 11th, 2000, Milligan had approached a 10-year-old boy at a park in Dallas, Oregon, and offered him $100 to mow his lawn. The boy agreed to the offer and accompanied Milligan to his car until he suddenly turned to him and said, quote, "Do you want to live or die?" Milligan then bound the boy's hands with duct tape and forced him into the car before driving away. After stopping in a remote field just outside of Salem, Milligan forced the boy to exit the vehicle and walk down a dirt road. He then proceeded to sexually assault and choke him, and the boy blacked out after Milligan shoved his face into the dirt. Milligan then slashed the victim's throat and fled the scene, but remarkably, the boy survived the attack and was able to go to the nearest road and seek help by flagging down a passing motorist. He ultimately wound up surviving and identified Milligan as his attacker, and he was subsequently tracked down and charged with kidnapping, sodomy, sex abuse, and attempted aggravated murder. Believe it or not, at the time this attack took place, Milligan was 3 days away from going to court for sexually abusing another young boy. Milligan had previously worked as a psychiatric aide on the children's ward of the Oregon State Hospital before he became a group life coordinator with the Oregon Youth Authority. His duties would involve traveling around to juvenile prisons throughout the state in order to provide counseling to troubled youths, and an 11-year-old boy had accused Milligan of sexually molesting and attempting to sodomize him in Seaside in August of 1997. The boy lived in a foster home, and Milligan had reportedly been a mentor and a father figure to him, and threatened to kill himself if the victim told anyone about the assault, which is why it took the boy 2 years to come forward. After Milligan was arrested on these charges, he was released on a $250,000 bail posted by his mother, which gave him the opportunity to attack the 10-year-old boy in Dallas. Milligan pled guilty to abusing the 11-year-old from Seaside and received a 6.5-year prison sentence, but after agreeing to plead guilty to his vicious attack on the 10-year-old, Milligan received an additional 30-year sentence, which would not begin until his previous sentence was completed. During Milligan's sentencing phase, the survivor got the chance to confront him in court and told him to, quote-unquote, rot in hell. Before he entered his guilty plea, Milligan had been incarcerated at the Marion County Jail and allegedly bragged about Derrick Engebretson's murder to his cellmate, which is what compelled him to write a letter to the Engebretson family. When the Oregon State Police questioned Milligan about this, he confessed that on the day Derrick disappeared, he was driving down a road in Klamath County near Winema National Forest when he saw the boy emerge from the woods. He then proceeded to pick up Derrick and give him a ride before he sexually assaulted and murdered him and buried his body at Silver Falls State Park. In exchange for leading the authorities to the location of Derrick's remains, Milligan agreed to plead guilty to the murder if he was spared the death penalty. An extensive search would be performed of Silver Falls State Park using ground-penetrating radar, with Lori and Robert Engebretson in attendance. While Milligan took the authorities to the spot where he said he disposed of Derrick's body, he didn't do much to help them find it, claiming that it was dark when he buried Derrick and he didn't know the area well. After several days of searching, investigators failed to turn up anything, and when Milligan was presented with the paperwork for his plea deal, he refused to sign it, and decided to completely recant his confession to Derrick's murder. While no definitive evidence has ever linked Milligan to the crime, he is still considered to be a strong suspect, as he did apparently drive a black 1988 Honda sedan at that time, which matched the description of the vehicle seen in the area on the day of Derrick's disappearance. While Milligan continued serving his prison sentence, another accusation of sexual abuse was made against him, this time from a former juvenile inmate at the McLaren Youth Correctional Facility in Woodburn. The victim claimed that Milligan had assaulted him on multiple occasions in 1998 while working as a group life coordinator with the Oregon Youth Authority. He said he had blocked out the incidents for many years, but his memories started coming back when the Penn State University child abuse scandal started dominating the news, so he decided to come forward in 2012. As a result, Milligan was charged with 2 counts of first-degree sexual assault and 1 count of first-degree unlawful sexual penetration, and was found guilty on all charges when he went on trial in September of 2015. Milligan wound up receiving an additional sentence of 35 years in prison, which will not begin until after he completes his previous sentences in 2036. As for Robert and Lori Engebretson, they were interviewed about Derrick's disappearance by KTVL News 10 in December of 2018, and stated that they no longer believe that Milligan kidnapped their son. However, they have still not written off the idea that Derrick was kidnapped by someone, as Lori stated, quote, "I want to believe that he's still alive to this day, and until somebody shows me something different, I don't think I'm ever going to give up on him," end quote. However, after 23 years, there's still no conclusive answers about what actually happened to Derrick Engebretson. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Now let's move on to our second story. Our next story begins in Maine in 1975, and our central figure is 4-year-old Kurt Newton, who lives with his parents, Ron and Jill Newton, as well as his 6-year-old sister Kim, in Manchester. On the damp, chilly morning of Sunday, August the 31st, the Newtons and 3 other families from Manchester were in the midst of a Labor Day weekend camping trip at the Natanis Point Campground, located in the wilderness township of Chain of Ponds. The Newtons went to the campground in a tent trailer they owned, and sometime between 10 and 10:30 a.m., Jill went to a bathhouse located 50 yards away in order to wash some mud-soaked sneakers. At the time, Kurt was riding his big-wheel tricycle around the campsite while his sister was playing a game in another section of the campground. Ron Newton decided to drive off in his Bronco in order to go chop some firewood, and while no one actually saw what happened next, one of the campers would later say she heard Kurt say, "Daddy, Daddy," from her trailer, which suggested that Kurt may have been attempting to follow his father as he drove away. Shortly thereafter, a 12-year-old camper named Lou Ellen Hansen was walking back to the campsite down a road and was about a quarter-mile away when she saw Kurt riding past her on his tricycle alone. Even though Lou Ellen yelled out, quote, "Do your parents know where you are?" Kurt ignored her and just kept pedaling down the road, but this would turn out to be the last confirmed sighting of him. Jill Newton soon returned to the campsite from the bathhouse, and even though she had only been gone for about 10 minutes, Jill was surprised to discover that Kurt was gone. When she started searching for Kurt, Jill crossed paths with Lou Ellen's father, Jack Hansen, who served as volunteer caretaker for the campground. Jack claimed that he had come across an abandoned big-wheel tricycle on the road about 0.8 of a mile away from the campsite, located next to a steep rise, which led to a nearby dump site where campers disposed of their trash. Believing that the tricycle had been discarded, Hansen tossed it into a trash heap at the dump. This prompted Jill and a number of other campers to rush to the dump site, but while they found the tricycle, Kurt was nowhere in sight, and there did not appear to be any child's footprints in the wet sand either. After Kurt was reported missing, an extensive search would be performed of the surrounding woods, which involved bloodhounds, National Guardsmen, over 1,500 volunteers, and several military helicopters, including a C-130H gunship plane using infrared sensors. A Fish and Game Warden inspector even spoke through a loudspeaker from one of the helicopters in hopes of capturing Kurt's attention, stating, quote, "Kurt, I'm up in the helicopter. Your mommy and daddy are waiting for you, and I want you to follow me back to the camp. Walk towards the helicopter. Don't sit down. Just stand up and walk, and I'll take you back." End quote. At one point, inmates from a pair of local minimum security prisons were brought in to participate in the search, which was considered to be the largest in the history of Maine up until that point, and it even drew a visit from State Governor James B. Longley. Right before nightfall on the date Kurt went missing, Jill Newton and some other witnesses thought they heard a child's voice in the woods near the dump site, but even though Jill repeatedly called out Kurt's name, she never got a response. According to his parents, Kurt was a very shy child who did not like being separated from his mother, even for a few moments. Since he did not have a history of wandering away without permission, Ron and Jill did not believe he would have gone into the woods on his own and feared that he was the victim of an abduction. In fact, since the campground was located only 6 miles from the US-Canada border, they wondered if someone might have taken Kurt out of the country into Quebec. Every person who was at the campground that day was questioned, and some even agreed to be polygraphed, but while one camper reported having seen a white station wagon driving quickly out of the campground, no cars matching that description had been registered there, and no other witnesses recalled seeing it. With no direct evidence of an abduction, the authorities were inclined to believe that after riding away from the campsite on his tricycle, Kurt eventually went in the wrong direction and got confused while trying to find his way back. By the following night, the weather had considerably worsened and temperatures dropped below freezing, so the searchers feared that Kurt would not have been able to survive long without shelter. Even though the massive search effort lasted for nearly 2 weeks, it failed to turn up any trace of Kurt, but his parents would continue to make several more trips to the area on weekends in order to perform their own independent searches. The Newtons also went to the trouble of printing up some French-language missing posters and distributing them throughout Quebec, in case Kurt had been taken across the border into Canada. And when enough time had passed that Kurt reached the age when he was old enough to enroll in school, Ron and Jill decided to mail letters and posters with Kurt's picture to every school district in the United States, on the chance that he had been kidnapped and was now living elsewhere under a new identity. In total, it's believed that they mailed out over 75,000 posters, and while some schools responded by providing photographs of students who looked like Kurt, none of them turned out to be him. Over the years, there would be numerous reported sightings of Kurt throughout the United States and Canada, and while most of them turned out to be cases of mistaken identity, a Connecticut man claimed he saw a blonde-haired boy matching Kurt's description while he was camping in the Canadian Rockies. The witness said the boy appeared to have a nervous expression on his face and was accompanied by an unidentified man, but the sighting has never been substantiated. Kurt's story would eventually vanish from the spotlight, though it took a very bizarre and unexpected turn in July of 2017, when a woman released a YouTube video claiming to be Jennifer Klein, a 3-year-old girl who had gone missing while camping with her family near Moab, Utah, on May the 25th, 1974. The woman said she had been kidnapped by a satanic cult, who were also responsible for abducting other missing children from that time period, including Kurt Newton and 6-year-old Eitan Pates, who made headlines when he vanished from New York City on May the 26th, 1979. However, it was eventually revealed that the whole thing was nothing more than a hoax, as DNA testing proved that this woman was not actually Jennifer Klein. There's nothing to suggest that Kurt or any of these other missing children were actually abducted by a satanic cult, so after 36 years, his disappearance continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to send out a special thanks to Faraday Brand Clothing, as we are very excited that they are now sponsoring The Trail Went Cold. Faraday is a family-run brand making high-quality, timeless clothing with modern design and functionality. It seems like the holiday season starts earlier and earlier every year, but I'm excited to make up for lost time and all the cancelled plans of late. But as much as I look forward to the holidays each year, living in the cold, icy tundra of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, I know that I will always need warm, comfortable, and cozy clothing before I venture into the snowy winter weather. If you're searching for the coziest gifts that are practical and stylish, like flannels that seem as if you had them for years, or lush sweaters, festive tops, and dresses that can still be worn long after the champagne has been popped, well, Faherty has the options to cover you. In fact, Faherty is so confident in the quality of their items that they have a lifetime guarantee of quality. No matter what, they'll replace or fix your clothes forever. Since we're approaching the holidays, I decided to not only order some Faherty clothing for myself, but as Christmas gifts for others as well. In addition to offering cozy outfits for the cold winter weather, you also have the option of ordering comfortable and stylish clothing for warmer weather, so you can bet I'll be wearing various Faherty clothes all year round once they arrive. There are major shipping delays happening this year, so now's the time to start shopping and get all your gifts before the holidays. Get 20% off your first purchase by going to fahertybrand.com/cold and using the promo code COLD at checkout. That's FAHERTY brand.com/cold with promo code COLD at checkout to get 20% off your first purchase. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. So it goes without saying that the disappearances of Derrick Engebretson and Kurt Newton are incredibly heartbreaking, as they both involve the victims' families taking their eyes off their children during a trip into the wilderness, and in those surroundings, it only takes a brief amount of time for them to wander off and vanish without a trace. In both these cases, the parents were obviously racked with immense guilt about losing their child, but were absolutely relentless in their efforts to try and find them, as they kept returning to the area to perform their own searches long after the official search efforts came to an end. I mentioned earlier that Robert Engebretson spent so much time searching for his son in freezing weather that he wound up getting pneumonia, and while performing his own search, Ron Newton wound up tripping and injuring his ankle. In spite of this, Ron continued to remain in the woods, repeatedly calling his son's name through a loudspeaker, and he refused to get any sleep. Finally, after Ron stayed awake for 4 consecutive nights, his friends became desperate enough to put tranquilizers into his coffee until he passed out. I'm sure they meant well, but needless to say, I'm pretty sure something like that would not fly today. However, even though the Newtons pulled out all the stops and were tireless in their efforts to find Kurt in the years following his disappearance, it seems like they shied away from the spotlight these past few decades. In the early 2010s, when a couple of publications wrote articles about Kurt's disappearance, the Newtons always declined the requests to be interviewed, so I have no idea what they or their daughter Kim are up to today, or if Jill and Ron are even still alive. It's certainly possible that they no longer believe Kurt was abducted, and have come to terms with the fact that he might have simply died of exposure in the woods, and his remains will be impossible to recover after all this time, so they've just elected to move on with their lives. But while there's no evidence that anyone else was involved in Kurt's disappearance, a suspect has confessed to the abduction and murder of Derrick Engebretson, so this possibility cannot be completely ruled out in his case. Unfortunately, Derrick's disappearance led to a major downward spiral for Lori and Robert Engebretson, as they eventually went bankrupt, and for a while, it also caused them to drift apart from their other 2 children, Amy and Kenny. The Engebretsons found it difficult to participate in some of their traditional family outings, such as camping, because it stirred up too many memories of Derrick, but it sounds like Lori and Robert's relationship with their other children was rekindled when Amy gave birth to their first grandchild. However, I'm not sure things were ever the same between Robert and his own father, Bob Engebretson, since Bob was supposed to be watching over Derrick when he went missing. In fact, at one point during the search effort, Derrick's maternal grandfather, Ben Davis, who had a very close relationship with the boy and often went hunting with him, lost his temper and punched Bob in the face. Sadly, Bob passed away in 2012, and I'm not sure if he ever had a reconciliation with his son. It sounds like the Engebretsons also held a lot of resentment towards the Klamath County Sheriff's Office and the Klamath County Search and Rescue Team for not reacting quickly enough to the emergency call about Derrick's disappearance. It actually took them nearly 5 hours to begin the search for Derrick because the search and rescue team were holding their annual awards banquet at a restaurant located 30 miles from the scene, and the coordinator was reluctant to interrupt them. When you're talking about an 8-year-old boy who went missing in the woods during a snowstorm in December, that's a lot of potentially crucial time which was lost, and if Derrick was actually abducted and murdered, then the perpetrator would have had ample opportunity to flee the area and cover up the crime. Under normal circumstances, it would be easy to assume that Derrick simply got lost in the woods and died of exposure, and if you look through the earliest newspaper coverage of this case, you get the impression that's exactly what happened, and there wasn't any reason to believe that an outside party was responsible. I've referenced a number of cases on this podcast where someone went missing in the wilderness, and the original search effort failed to find them, but then the victim's remains would be found in the same area years after the fact, and it turned out they were there the entire time. When you're dealing with the wilderness, it's not uncommon for animals to scatter the victim's remains, and even though the searches for both Derrick and Kurt were very extensive, they were also hampered by bad weather hitting the area almost immediately after the boys went missing, so you can understand why the search teams might have failed to find them. Of course, this is pretty much a no-win situation for the Engebretson and Newton families, since both options are terrible. Either their son died while cold and alone in the woods, or they were abducted by someone who did them harm. At one point, Lori Engebretson even stated that she preferred Derrick died in the woods rather than at the hands of some monster, but I'm sure Lori still clung to the idea that Derrick could have been abducted, since that meant there was a chance he was being held captive and might still be alive somewhere. Since Kurt was only 4 years old when he went missing, I think his parents were hoping that he was being raised by someone under a false identity and might have forgotten who he really was. In both these cases, the area where the boys went missing was pretty remote, and it would seem that the odds of them crossing paths out there with a predator who abducted them were pretty slim. In fact, the lead detective on Kurt's case even stated, quote, "With so many children available in the cities, why would a kidnapper come to one of the most remote campgrounds in the state, hoping to find a child riding a tricycle alone down a deserted road?" End quote. However, there is some evidence that Frank Milligan could have been involved in Derrick's disappearance. After Derrick became separated from his family, Ben Davis was able to track his footprints to a clearing and found a snow angel which was obviously made by the boy. This clearing was in close enough proximity to the road that Derrick could have conceivably made it there and been picked up by someone. We have an eyewitness account from a motorist who claimed he saw a boy struggling with a man by the side of the road, as well as a black Honda sedan driving through the area that day, a vehicle which Milligan apparently owned during that time period. I guess the one issue with the eyewitness sighting is that I'm not sure if he ever specified seeing a black Honda or any other vehicle parked nearby, which an abductor would have needed to transport Derrick out of the area. Now, in December of 1998, Milligan was living in the town of Kaiser, which is about 260 miles away, but he was also working as a group life coordinator with the Oregon Youth Authority, and his job required him to travel around the state a lot to visit various juvenile prisons. I'm not sure how thoroughly investigators were able to check Milligan's whereabouts during this time period, but it's worth noting that the location where Derrick went missing is about 30 miles away from Klamath Falls, which has its own juvenile correctional facility. Theoretically, if Milligan was in Klamath County on that particular date, he could have been passing through the area when he came across Derrick by the side of the road. If he pulled over and Derrick told him he was lost, Milligan could have easily offered him a ride and taken advantage of the situation. Remember, it would be less than 2 years later when Milligan forced a 10-year-old boy into his car by offering to pay him to mow his lawn. He then proceeded to sexually assault the boy and slash his throat, and it was only through some miracle that the victim lived to tell about it. We know that Milligan has sexually assaulted at least 3 victims, and given that it took years for 2 of them to come forward, he very well could have additional victims we don't even know about. If that wasn't enough, Milligan was also known for collecting child pornography and had a history of impersonating a 13-year-old boy online in order to send emails to other children and stalk them. It sounds like Milligan was able to use his position of power to groom his victims and frighten or guilt them into staying silent after they were abused. He would tell them that since he was an authority figure and they were juvenile offenders, no one would believe them if they said anything. As you recall, when Milligan attempted to murder the 10-year-old, he was out on bail after being charged with sexually abusing an 11-year-old. In fact, since Milligan had been a relatively respected figure up until that point, he had enough people who were willing to speak on his behalf in order to convince the court to grant bail. Following his release, Milligan had been seen playing basketball with children at a park which violated the conditions of his bail, and this prompted prosecutors to ask a circuit court judge to have Milligan return to jail. However, since the court order forbidding contact with minors had been omitted from the paperwork Milligan received, the judge elected not to revoke his bail. So needless to say, there was a major backlash to this decision, since the attack on the 10-year-old could have easily been prevented. Technically, Milligan has never been charged or convicted of any murders, but since he slashed this boy's throat and left him for dead, we know he's definitely capable of it, and could have done something similar to Derrick. Another lead which has been the subject of debate in this case is some graffiti which was found written on a restroom wall in September of 1999. It supposedly made reference to a possible abduction and murder of Derrick, though the authorities have never revealed the graffiti's exact contents. This particular rest area was about 250 miles northeast from the location where Derrick went missing, as well as a 4.5-hour drive from Kaiser if you're looking for a potential connection to Frank Milligan. Like I mentioned earlier, Milligan's job required him to travel through the state a lot, so he could have left the graffiti himself, but since Derrick's disappearance got a lot of coverage in the Oregon media during this time period, anyone could have written it. I know the initial reaction from Derrick's parents was that the whole thing was probably a cruel joke, and the authorities seemed to lead towards that as well. The only reason Milligan popped up on the radar as a suspect to begin with is because of a letter sent to the Engebretsons from one of Milligan's former cellmates who claimed he overheard Milligan brag about Derrick's murder. Obviously, statements provided by jailhouse informants can be notoriously unreliable and should be taken with a huge grain of salt, but since Milligan flat out confessed to the crime when confronted about this, there's good reason to believe this informant was telling the truth. Milligan claimed that he buried Derrick's body in Silver Falls State Park, but a search turned up nothing, and while this location is in fairly close proximity to where Milligan was living at the time, it's also about a 5-hour drive from where Derrick went missing. I don't know if Milligan would have driven that far to dispose of Derrick's body, and you also have to consider the fact that Klamath County was hit with a blizzard that day, which are not exactly ideal circumstances to perform an abduction and drive a lengthy distance with a captive boy or his body inside your vehicle. I know that convicted criminals will sometimes confess to crimes they did not commit in order to toy with the authorities, and leading them on wild goose chases does offer a temporary reprieve from prison, which is what happened here when Milligan accompanied the authorities on their unsuccessful search for Derrick's body. Now, Milligan did agree to a plea deal in which he would confess to the crime in exchange for not receiving the death penalty, until he suddenly decided to back out and recant his confession. Even though Milligan had received a pair of prison sentences totaling 36 years for his other crimes, he was still a relatively young man when he went inside, and would have been in his late 60s when he finished serving these sentences. There was always a chance that Milligan could be released someday, so even if he was guilty, this might explain why he decided not to spend the rest of his life in prison for Derrick's murder. However, in 2015, Milligan received an additional 35 years in prison after he was convicted of sexually abusing another boy, and since the sentence will not even start until his current sentence comes to an end, this pretty much guarantees that Milligan is going to remain locked up for the rest of his life. If Milligan really did kill Derrick, he's pretty much got nothing left to lose at this point, but then again, even though child molesters are already considered to be the lowest of the low in prison, the only thing worse is to be considered a child murderer. So this might be why Milligan is reluctant to take full responsibility. The fact of the matter is that there is really no hard evidence that Milligan did anything to Derrick other than his own confession. The impression I get from recent interviews with the Engebretsons is that they haven't ruled out the possibility that Derrick was abducted, they just no longer believe it was Milligan who did it. However, from my standpoint, I think the odds are pretty low that Derrick would have crossed paths with a completely different child predator in that remote wilderness area of Oregon on that particular day, so if Derrick was a victim of foul play, Milligan seems like the only plausible suspect. Of course, we technically have no evidence that Derrick died in the woods either, but even if he died of exposure and animals scattered his remains, it seems like the one piece of evidence which might shed some light on what happened to him is the hatchet he was carrying at the time he went missing. If someone attempted to attack Derrick and he tried to defend himself, a hatchet would have been a pretty effective weapon, but since it has never been found, we can only speculate. Whatever the case, this is a horrible and tragic story for everyone involved, but maybe one of these days, Either Milligan will decide to reveal the whole truth, or someone will come across Derrick's remains and his family will finally receive conclusive answers about what happened. So what about Kurt Newton's disappearance? Well, that particular case does not have its own Frank Milligan, as no one has ever popped up on the radar as a potential suspect. But it also sounds like Kurt disappeared during a very narrow window of time, and since there's virtually no evidence to suggest what happened to him, it almost feels like he literally vanished into thin air. If Kurt did not succumb to the elements and die of exposure, an alternate theory which I have seen proposed is that he could have been attacked and killed by some sort of wild animal. However, at the very least, you'd think this would have left behind some sort of evidence, such as blood or clothing, but the largest search effort in the history of Maine failed to turn up anything. Given the close proximity of the Natanis Point Campground to the US-Canada border, it's very tempting to believe that someone managed to abduct Kurt and smuggle him out of the country, as border security obviously wouldn't have been as tight back in 1975. But the problem is that the logistics of a kidnapper getting Kurt out of the campground without being seen sound incredibly difficult, if not impossible. But let's look at the circumstances of how Kurt went missing. Even though Kurt was described as a very shy kid who did not like to separate himself from his family and wander off on his own, I get the impression that when Kurt saw his father leaving the campsite in his Bronco to go chop firewood, he decided to take off after him on his tricycle. At the time, Kurt's mother was also away from the campsite at the bathhouse, and his sister was off playing a game somewhere, so if he believed he was being left alone, Kurt might have had the urge to follow his father. Since Kurt's tricycle was found unattended about 0.8 of a mile from the campsite, he somehow got separated from it, but the original Maine Warden Service search report about Kurt's disappearance is actually available online, and it paints a very detailed picture of the geography of this location. So if one was to leave the campsite on the road where Kurt was last seen, they would wind up at a fork 0.7 of a mile away. Kurt's tricycle was found on the left fork next to a steep rise, which led to a dump site, and after that, the road was completely blocked by debris, such as trees which had fallen over. This means that if someone had abducted Kurt from the location in a vehicle, there's no conceivable way they would have been able to leave the area by taking the left fork in the road. Their only options would be to drive in the opposite direction back to the campsite, where they definitely would have been seen by witnesses, or to take the right fork in the road, which led to another road located 2 miles away. The problem with this option? Rod Newton had already taken the right fork in his Bronco before he stopped to chop wood, and as far as I can tell, he did not report seeing any other vehicles on the road the entire time he was there before he drove back to the campsite. Indeed, when trackers checked this road during the search effort, they found no evidence of any recent vehicle traffic beyond the spot where Ron had been chopping wood. The only eyewitness report we have of any potentially suspicious vehicles in the area that day was a sighting of a white station wagon speeding out of the campground, but no other witnesses recalled seeing it. Given the geography, the only way the driver of the station wagon could have abducted Kurt without being seen by any witnesses is if Kurt somehow managed to wander through the woods to an entirely different road which was farther away from the campsite. But again, what are the odds of Kurt crossing paths with a random predator at such a remote location? Of course, the other possible option is that Kurt was not actually abducted, but murdered by someone in the woods who managed to conceal his body. If you read any online discussions about this case, you'll find a few commenters expressing their suspicions about Jack Hansen, the campground caretaker who found Kurt's abandoned tricycle and tossed it into a trash heap at the dump site. Indeed, it does seem pretty odd that Hansen would do this, rather than at least try to find out who the tricycle belonged to. However, it sounds like we're talking about a very limited window of time in which Hansen would have had the opportunity to do anything. Remember, Jill Newton was only away from the campsite of the bathhouse for about 10 minutes or so, and while I don't know the exact specifics of the timeline, it sounds like it was only a short time later when Jill crossed paths with Hansen and he told her about tossing the tricycle into the dump. If Hansen had harmed Kurt, I'm not sure why he would even admit to disposing of the tricycle to begin with, and it sounds like there wouldn't have been much time at all for him to get rid of Kurt's body. Sources say that everyone who was present at the campground that day was questioned by the authorities, and some of them agreed to take polygraph tests, so I'd like to think that Hansen was thoroughly investigated and did not raise any red flags to suggest he might have been involved. Overall, The most plausible explanation for Kurt's disappearance would seem to be that when he left the campsite to follow his father, he eventually wound up at the fork in the road, but went left instead of right. Since the left fork had a steep rise, that might explain why Kurt elected to walk in that direction instead of riding his tricycle, but it wasn't long before he got lost, and he was long gone by the time Jack Hansen arrived at the scene. Members of the search team also mentioned that these woods contained a number of holes which would have been easy for a small child to fall into, so this provides one potential explanation for why Kurt was never found. Once again, getting lost in the woods and dying of exposure is a horrible way for a young child to die, but unlike the Derrick Engebretson case, there is just no evidence pointing to the involvement of an outside party. While I'm still on the fence about what happened to Derrick, I think it's most likely that Kurt perished in the woods somewhere. After all these years, there may not be much evidence left to find, but it would certainly be nice to get a conclusive resolution in either of these cases. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Derrick Engebretson, please contact the Klamath County Sheriff's Office at 541-883-5130. That's 541-883-5130. And if you have any information on the disappearance of Kurt Newton, please contact the Maine State Police at 207-289-2155. That's 207-289-2155. But if you just have your own thoughts about either of these cases, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. I just released a bonus episode about a controversial unsolved mysteries case of a missing Marine named Kurt Borton, who was supposedly killed in action during the Vietnam War, but his family became convinced he survived and returned to the United States. I'm also going to be dropping the occasional exclusive bonus Patreon episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, and we recently released an episode in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discussed the unsolved 1971 disappearance of Lynn Schulze, whose case has been linked to recently convicted murderer Robert Durst. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Jessica V, Jody A, David B, and Aaron PM. Thank you all so much for your support. In addition, I wanted to announce that this coming Saturday, December the 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we are going to be holding our final Unsolved Mysteries Live Watch Marathon of 2021. At this event, we will be screening classic segments from Unsolved Mysteries, and you can watch along and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. The link to the screening room where our live watch takes place can be found in our show notes for this episode, and it's also pinned at the top of our social media pages. So once again, our Unsolved Mysteries Live Watch is happening this coming Saturday, December the 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope to see you there. I'm also pleased to announce that The Trail Went Cold has been added to the lineup for Podcast Row at CrimeCon 2022, which is being held in Las Vegas from April the 29th until May the 1st. If you would like to purchase tickets, we already have our own personalized promo code to get a discount. So to receive a 10% discount off a standard badge, please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code TRAIL. Once again, that's crimecon.com and the promo code is TRAIL. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the ear music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.